Hey guys! Part 6 of What If Naruto was in Mass Effect. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are pain, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 23. The First Step Down the Rabbit Hole. Presidium Promenade, Citadel, 10 o'clock May 10th, 2184. Tethys, a Sari commando and member of the Talian's Daughters Mercenary Company. No sign of the targets, just the normal activity around the shipyard. As she relayed the information to Sister Taliais, the old friend that she had owed more than one favor to, Tethys was honestly starting to wonder what her friend had gotten her into. She, and 3 other ex-Asari commando operatives that seemed to be here for similar reasons as she was, were quite clearly being used as cutouts for some reason. It was standard Asari Black operations protocol for hostile and dangerous targets, and so far the majority of their targets hadn't shown anything remotely close to such a protocol requirement. In fact, they hadn't seen any sign of the main focus of their op for almost 3 days, since his meeting with the head of CCC on his first day back on the Citadel. He was the main one Tethys was worried about, but other than a bunch of arrests at the shipyard there had been no other signs of a security presence, or any action taken against their monitoring. Disappointing, but expected. Given the size of the ship he's taken and the fallout of the attack on the human colony, he is probably working on paperwork and other bureaucratic nonsense. Still, we would like more information about this Naruto Uzumaki before he has a chance to further act against the sisters. This wasn't the first time the alarm bells had started ringing in Tethys' head about this whole affair, even as Sister Talise reached into the pocket on her dress and pulled out a small memory drive, but it was now ringing louder and more insistently. The Sisters of Reflection were meant to be an Asari order that kept to the interior of Asari space around their temple on Haishiana, as well as being focused on discourse and diplomacy rather than this type of subterfuge. That wasn't to say that the sisters didn't indulge in such professions. All Asari were as familiar with such skills in one manner or another, but the way Sister Taliais and the other members of her coven were acting was wrong for the lack of a better word. Basic commando recon and stealth training would have dictated that in addition to hiring Tethys and the others, through monetary means, blackmail, or a combination of the two, there should have been at least 2 more layers of backstopping through unaffiliated groups and other disposable elements that couldn't lead back to any Asari at all. This drive contains several tracking and data retrieval programs. You are to get this into the shipyard's internal systems, or even better on the ship itself. Mother Raylia realizes that such a difficult task is not what you signed up for, but Tethys didn't even give her time to offer whatever compensation was going to be put on the table, shaking her head firmly before putting down the cup she had been drinking from. No. I signed up for monitoring and tailing a few targets, as part of the deal agreed between the sisters and the Talian's daughters, and that was only because of the favors I owed you. I am expected back on Thesha by the end of next week, and I intend to meet that deadline. There was a flash of fury that crossed Sister Taliai's deep purple-hued face that almost made Tethys flinch with its intensity. Another reaction that was so out of character Tethys almost thought she was dealing with an imposter of some sort. Then the look was gone, replaced with the normal serene expression that was expected from Asari sisters, though Taliai's hands were still clenched on the table between them. Even for 100,000 credits? Such an offer is far more than you would earn as part of your little group. Rather than entice her, as such a large amount of money was no doubt intended to, Tethys' resolve hardened as she realized she was right. I would only earn it if I was alive and free to collect it, and I wasn't stupid enough to merely take the intelligence you provided about these guys at face value. Taliais. Admittedly, most of what she had heard was only rumors at best, but her contacts in CCC had confirmed 2 key facts about this Naruto Uzumaki human. I found it strange that your briefing missed the parts about the crew being affiliated with Spectres and the Council, as well as the shipyard owner having led several large CCC-supported operations against pretty much every type of gang on the Citadel. And given those 2 anecdotes indicated at the very least a competent combatant, if not someone who did his best to avoid letting such events become public knowledge, Tethys saw the offered 100,000 credits for what they were. So I won't be agreeing to become your Narola, and roughly translates to agree bearer, equivalent to the term fall guy in English, and I won't accept your blood money to go behind my sisters' backs. Find a Solarian or a human if you want someone to die for credits. Whilst normally such a refusal was simply the first step in the long and intricate dance that constituted Asari bargaining, Tethys had every intention of getting off the citadel as soon as possible and not looking back. Standing before Taliai's could form an articulate response, the sister seemingly caught between maintaining her serene mask and unleashing the fury that Tethys could see barely rested beneath the surface. Tethys moved over to the exit of the restaurant they had been meeting in without another word. The sooner she was off station, the sooner she could get back to the simple life of a huntress, and hopefully she would avoid the fallout of whatever plan the sisters seemed to have. However, she realized in the first 5 minutes of leaving the restaurant that she was being followed, at least 3 other members of the sisters that she had tagged on her way back to her hotel in the Citadel wards. Normally in such a situation Tethys would have laughed at what was obviously an attempt to either intimidate or silence her, but the latest CSCC security measures had put her at a considerable disadvantage now. She had entered the Citadel as a civilian, rather than risking the attention her mercenary alias would have attracted to her mission, so she hadn't been allowed to carry anything bigger than a small holdout pistol, or even wear light combat armor. Granted, she still had her biotic powers, but against 3 or more other Asari such a talent was a lot less useful than it would be against other aggressors. Make that 6 Asari, Tethys thought with a small feeling of despair forming in her stomach as she entered one of the normally crowded side streets of the wards, finding instead 3 sisters of reflection stood rather arrogantly in the middle of the street, weapons drawn and ready. You should not have refused our offer. As one of the sisters spoke, with the same almost blunt manner that had concerned her about Sister Taliai's, Tethys shifted to one side of the street. As they were on both sides of her, she couldn't fully hope to bottleneck them and remove their numbers' advantage, but this would allow her to keep an eye on them all until the bull. You know, this almost looks like someone is trying to perform a shakedown on my turf. Her thoughts were interrupted by someone calling out from behind the sisters who had been following her, causing everyone to turn in that direction. A single human, even dressed in full combat armor and with a pair of submachine guns at his waist, and stood at the entrance to the street she had entered at, wouldn't be what Tethys would call intimidating. I assume these belong to you. The fact he was dragging a clearly unconscious sister by the neck with each hand did certainly up the intimidation and awe factor, tossing them both on the ground in front of him before looking straight in their direction with his skull-masked visor. You dare obstruct our business, human. The sister that had spoken to her before spoke with an angry tone that matched with the nimbus of biotic energy that was now pulsating around her upper body, the other sisters following her lead and making it clear this was about to get violent. But 3 versus 1 was much better odds for Tethys, especially as they had all foolishly stopped paying attention to her, and she wasn't going to let her chance go to waste. She was building up to a sprint a moment later, pistol drawn and firing. She preferred a sniper rifle and long-range combat, patience and strategy, 2 things she excelled in, but she wasn't a huntress for no reason. 2 pistol rounds caught the sister on the left high in the chest, whilst her biotic throws slammed the one on the right into a pair of waste disposal containers with an audible crack. The remaining sister managed to get her pistol up in time to fire a single round, Tethys wincing as it buried itself in her right shoulder, but her return fire was far more effective. As the sister collapsed backwards, blood leaking from her ruined eye socket, Tethys considered running without looking back. She was already injured and there were almost certainly other sisters on the Citadel. But that last thought was the reason she looked over to her erstwhile ally, thinking that helping the human would be beneficial for her long-term survival. Even if they parted ways here, 2 targets were better than 1. Very impressive. Clearly they were right to bring such numbers against you. The human didn't seem like he would need her help, given the 3 sisters that had faced him were either unconscious or dead on the Durasteel floor, all done seemingly without the man even drawing a weapon. Though I am a little disappointed, when I was employed to target Matriarch Benezia's spying operations on the Citadel, I expected. The disappointment the human was expressing with his voice seemed genuine enough, even as he walked towards her in a relaxed manner, despite the fact she had her pistol raised and aimed right for his face plate. Never mind, I see you are injured, and no doubt CSCC is on its way. I'm assuming you wish to avoid being involved in that particular shit show? The human didn't even give her time to respond, tossing her a data chit with remarkable accuracy even as he turned away from her once more and started looking through the pockets of one of the sisters he had downed. That would be preferable, human, though I doubt I can get treated for a gunshot wound on the Citadel without it being reported, so running would only make me seem guilty. That and the issue with her using a civilian alias and then taking down 3 people in an ambush, but that issue was pretty much unavoidable either way. Head to the Michelle Clinic, it isn't too far from here. Tell her you are an associate of mine, my description or the code-named Skull should be enough. She is known for her discretion and her willingness to treat anyone who comes to her clinic. Tethys didn't know the place offhand, her time on the Citadel pretty much entirely focused on the shipyards and the small area around her hotel, but that's what the extranet was for. She was turning to leave when she remembered the data chit the human had thrown at her. But as the sounds of shouting became audible, Tethys realized she would have to look at it later and discern its importance. Whatever it was, she resolved to herself that she would be dedicating considerable resources to finding out more about this Skull character. A man who can take down 5 Asari without drawing a weapon, even if they were sisters and not commandos or huntresses, was worth looking into as a contact at the very least. #%*+= Crew deck of the Will of Fire, Citadel Ward Shipyard, 1800 hours May 10, 2184. J.V. Carey Glavkar, First Officer of the Will of Fire and Interim Clan Head of the Glavkar. Right, that's enough for today. That was very impressive, everyone. Hit the showers and then feel free to head on to the Citadel for the evening. Even as J.V. Carey finished her last series of push-ups and pushed herself to her feet, she could see the somewhat confused faces of her clansmen. The idea of free time was something that most slave clan members never got to really experience. They were either working, training, or resting. And whilst the youngest members of the Glavkar clan were already being corralled by the small contingent of Quarians that were stationed on the Will of Fire towards the showers, the older members were looking to her. Carey-chan, everything okay? I don't want to push you guys too hard when you are all still recovering. More importantly, the rest of the clan were looking at the one that many of them considered their new master, and her as the new overseer. A lifetime of following orders without question and never talking back to the superior caste was not easily broken, though she knew not a single member of her clan regretted her decision to rebel in the slightest. The fact she had been forced to refuse extra offerings of food during their meal breaks was not only a novel experience, but one that still made her smile slightly when she was working on some of the more mind-numbing maintenance tasks they were performing on the ship. Still, now was not the time to get distracted, and with a quick glance around her gathered clan members, J.V. Carey made some subtle hand gestures that were Batarian slave code even as she responded verbally to her captain. We are all still capable of working, Captain. Given there is still work to be done on Deck 4 to make sure the ship is fully operational. Even as she stopped speaking at her captain's disappointed sigh, her facial muscles twitching unconsciously as she thought she had done something wrong, J.V. Carey managed to finish signing. Seconds, take 43 and 74 to quarters and treat. 54 and 62 go with the Kael Shalek, no embarrassment. All Batarian slave clan members had numbers more often than names, and whilst the Glavkar had both, the numbers were easier to sign. She had seen 2 members of her clan were struggling with injuries of one form or another, but to take them to the medical bay was a sign of weakness the clan couldn't afford. The other 2, some of the eldest clan members who hadn't been culled before the rebellion for being physically incapable, would be more useful in reining in the young bloods out on the Citadel than working after that exercise. Carey-chan, when I said there was free time. There was a sudden cough and the ship's medical officer, a relatively young human woman who had somehow gained 2 powerful positions aboard their ship, gave a glare that obviously meant something as the captain's posture changed considerably by the time he turned back to them. It was a display of insubordination that was remarkably common on the Will of Fire, J.V. Carey and the others having learned to stop reacting like someone was about to get executed for it on the first day after almost a dozen incidents. Right, I need to ease you guys into making your own decisions with your time. You 6 are to follow Narali-chan to the medical bay. Naruto pointed to the 2 J.V. Carey had prioritized, as well as 4 others who seemed to be struggling to recover more than the others. Either not noticing or not caring about the embarrassment JV Carey suddenly felt at her clan's shameful performance. Then the rest of you can go out and get some new clothes and armor. While I won't push on what clothes you get, I want no second-hand or shoddy armor suits for any of you. We have set up a joint account for your clan to use Carey-chan, and put the first 3 months' pay as well as a moderate figure for procuring armor in there. The details should be coming through to your OmniTool shortly. It already had come through in fact, and though JV Carey had never really handled credits directly before, she knew it was more than enough to outfit every member of her clan in brand new Mark III partisan light armor without touching the separate amount for their pay. Logically, JV Carey knew that such generosity was nothing more than exactly that, but emotionally it was both exhilarating and terrifying at the same time. Of course, Captain. Her training was screaming at her to leave it at that, to accept the orders of her captain and leave. But Captain, I would prefer if some of our group continued to help with the repairs. There was an actual audible gasp from behind her as she spoke up, something that would be admonished later in the clan quarters. I thought you might say that, Carey-chan. JV Carey managed to resist flinching, just as the Moss captain's hand slapped down lightly on her shoulder. In which case, I need you and your 3 lieutenants, or whatever else you call them, to pick me 10 people that are technologically adept and follow you and me up to the bridge. I also want you to appoint 5 people to help Nirali-chan with her inventorying and purchasing tasks, before she asks me for another 40% pay rise. It was like trying to tear out a damaged ship plate with her bare hands. Every time she built up the courage for the pain to come, the damn thing broke in a way that she didn't expect. The captain obviously knew that she and the other Batarians wouldn't stop working unless he explicitly ordered them to, and instead of lashing out to prove his authority to them, he was instead giving them tasks to perform that were not as labor-intensive as repairing the ship would have been. He had implied that she was going to be accompanying him somewhere separately, which meant she was probably going to be punished privately, and that she needed to assign a second to each of these tasks to make up for her absence. It would take at least 30 of them to search the wards effectively for suitable shops and the best deals, given the captain wanted them traveling in groups of no less than 5. Sergish, you are to lead the acquisition of our armor with 40 men, regular communication updates every 7 cycles to review progress. Kragan will help Quartermaster Badia. Take the remaining 7 with you to speed tasks along, across the tech specialists. Luckily the roles were easy to delegate, and with the 41 young bloods already accounted for, the numbers available to her for this clan shift fit the captain's requirements perfectly. JV Carey knew that the feeling in her upper gut was suspicion at her captain rising, as Akrask and the other members of the specialist group followed the captain and her into the main lift, but at the same time she was slightly relieved. With all the examples of poor discipline that they had seen over the last few days, she had started to become concerned that Spectre Shepard had given them to a poor master who didn't know how to control his underlings. The fact he was letting her insubordination stand without physical punishment was still a problem and something she would try to raise with him, but he had just managed to compromise her clan into doing something productive without letting them push themselves in such a way that the rest of them probably suspected nothing. So Carey-chan, how's the clan liking their new quarters? The somewhat unexpected question, as well as the light tone the captain spoke in as he glanced at her with his usual cheerful grin, somehow got around JV Carey's mental training. The young bloods are still marveling that every one of us now has allocated bunks and personal storage. We are not used to such. Her mind catching up with her treacherous tongue, JV Carey only kept herself from panicking because the captain had already known about the slave clan's previous living arrangements. Deck 10 had been the previous slave quarters, along with the sections of the ship for waste management and materials recycling. While JV Carey knew the packed rows of shoddily built and barely maintained bunk beds weren't anywhere near as bad as the living conditions of the merchandise from the Batarian slave raids, it still seemed to set something off in the captain. Deck 10 was currently being gutted, with the aim of putting in an additional set of ship weapons and their associated automated systems down there when they could afford it, and the Glavacker clan survivors were based on Deck 3, where the actual clan members should be staying. Excellent, I'm glad to hear you are all settling well, Carey-chan. I will pop by some time to see how you have personalized the quarters. I need some ideas of Batarian culture that aren't just about fighting and slaving. Ino-chan, Kasumi-chan. The elevator reached their destination at that point, the captain stepping out eagerly to greet some of the other crew that had been waiting for them, therefore missing the look she cast a crask of shared confusion. Given she had been born and raised as a slave, as had nearly every member of the Gladaka clan still among the living, she was almost entirely unaware that there was another part to Batarian culture. You're nearly late for the meeting, Naruto-kun. It won't look good to Executor Palin and the others if you aren't there on time. While the young blonde woman in front of them spoke calmly, there was an undertone that made JV Carey and the other Batarians stiffen slightly in place. Whilst many of the Urda clan members JV Carey had served under were dismissive of humans as anything other than slaves in waiting, despite her obvious injury, Officer Yamanaka carried herself in a similar way to the butcher of the clans, and JV Carey had seen the Spectre in action personally. Sorry, Ino-chan, but I thought Kasumi-chan would like some extra help with tracking all of the data we are getting about Benizia's operations on the Citadel, seeing as Carey-chan won't let her clan have a proper evening off. Any shame JV Carey might have felt about her impertinence being aired so brazenly evaporated as both women actually openly laughed out loud. What are you two laughing at? The sight of her captain almost flapping his arms around in a flustered manner was strangely endearing, even as Kasumi waved towards the other Batarians. Kettle-san, Meat-pot-san. It seemed that whatever Kasumi had just said confused more than just JV Carey, as she shook her head. I'll leave Inodano to clear that up, the rest of you can all come with me. It isn't like I wanted to go out tonight anyway. Officer Yamanaka scoffed at the statement before she grabbed the captain's arm, leading off towards the command room even as she started speaking once more. What I think Kasumi-chan was trying to point out, with her rather odd fascination about kitchenware aside, is that you cannot complain about other people not taking time off, Naruto-kun. I know you are sleeping less than 6 hours a night, and you haven't spent more than an hour doing something other than work or favors for another member of the crew since we got back to the Citadel. The captain seemed like he wanted to protest for a moment, before his posture relaxed and he suddenly seemed more at home with his surroundings. You know me too well, Ino-chan, but I've had to put in all this work to get things ready for when we head back out. Can't have the workers at the shipyard getting complacent because the boss from hell has left them without adequate supervision. That was another mark of a good master. The fact that he had such a tight hold on his off-ship operations was one of the reasons that the clan members thought that the captain's pleasant treatment of them so far was the Varan meat to the shock gauntlet, waiting for those who didn't toe the line. And the fact that you have a crew of more than 500 people means you have to start delegating some of these things you have going on. Officer Yamanaka raised her right hand and started listing things off in a manner that seemed more amused than upset now, even as the three of them reached the entrance to the command room. I mean, between captaining a ship that would have fitted most of Konoha's population inside, assisting a Spectre in a galaxy-wide hunt for a genocidal madman, running at least 4 businesses that I know about, working as a CCC private contractor and gathering information on at least a dozen gangs, coordinating relief and restructuring supplies for more than one colony, and who knows what else. The pair of Quarians who were standing guard at the door didn't seem surprised by the facts that Officer Yamanaka casually listed, though this was the first JV Carey had heard of at least half of the feats being thrown at the captain's feet. Captain on deck! The call from the deep green-suited Quarian male stood working on the ship's communicator system was another reminder of her clan's tenuous position, the captain having hired almost 200 new crew in the last 2 days alone. In addition to the 15 Quarians from the Ontario, there were almost 250 of the space rats now aboard the ship, at work to strip all but the most basic systems from the ship and replace them. And as much as JV Carey wanted to claim otherwise, the new systems they were putting in place were far more efficient, both in function and in labor requirements. Even as most of the crew pulled salutes and other signs of respect, there were some noticeable exceptions to this that JV Carey noted, though the one that was still talking to her father through the communicator was the one that had clearly held everyone's attention before they had arrived. And then Sarah showed me how to replace a software system. We've even been helping with laying some of the replacement wiring. Mum said she wouldn't teach me how to make things explode until I'm at least 50 though. Dad, I don't think I can last that long. You'll teach me, right? While JV Carey and her clan were pretty much cut off from events outside of Batarian space prior to their liberation, she'd wasted no time assigning her clan to gather whatever information they could find on their rescuers and their companions. Seeing any Krogan struggling to resist his daughter's pleading gaze was funny enough, especially as her mother glared at him from less than 3 feet behind her. But the fact that this was a Krogan clan leader whose bloody rampages stretched back centuries only made this situation all the more ridiculous. It seems that you have become weak with age, clan leader, if you are letting 2 Asari control you so. I hope you have more reason to call us than simply to publicly embarrass the Urdnot name. The speaker was unfamiliar to JV Carey, though to her all Krogan merely meant one thing. And that was death to her clan members, as they were used as fodder to slow the lizards down. This one was tall for his kind, battle-marked but clearly well-maintained silvered heavy armor covered with the same markings as Rex had on his armor. Despite his disparaging comments though, there was no real hostility in the Krogan's tone that JV Carey could pick out, but given Krogan culture was built on violence and death, maybe that was a bad sign. Say another bad thing about my daughter Dag and normally I would threaten to rip your throat out. But given you just insulted his blood daughter, I might not get the opportunity. Rex gestured behind the Krogan and the 2 bodyguards he had brought with him. Though before they had a chance to look around they were slammed off their feet in a surprising show of biotic strength. I realize you are new to my ship Ajibaka, so you have some leeway with the rules. Stood over the 3 down Krogan, with his body surrounded by a nimbus of biotic energy like JV Carey had never seen before, was the captain. But no one insults one of my Krant without consequence, especially someone who is only here on Rex's invitation. How he'd gotten from just in front of her to where he was standing without her noticing was mind-blowing, as well as the fact he had done it without anyone else noticing as well, it seemed. But even as her mind struggled to comprehend the action, her arm was recording this on her Omni tool as subtly as she could. The young bloods would learn exactly what the captain looked like when displeased. I'll rip your face off, human. But even as Dag forced himself to his feet, growling like an enraged animal, the captain merely stared right back, his expression so unlike his normal cheer it was scary. Despite his threat, Dag merely drew himself up to his full height and glowered at the captain for what felt like cycles. Weapons down, everyone. Remember, we have important guests, and I don't want to clean blood from my new suit so soon. It was at this point JV Carey pulled her focus away from the standoff to notice that pretty much every person in the room had drawn their sidearm to point at the Krogan. Though the fact Nora's gun was clearly a kid's one, which was making rather fake-sounding explosion sounds as she pulled the trigger while dancing in a circle round her mother, kind of spoiled the effect. Alina had to stow one of the 2 submachine guns she had drawn with a sigh that reverberated around the room, grabbing her daughter none too gently by the top of her head and fixing her in place in front of her. Nora dear. Not now! The sheer frustration in her his tone and body posture made Rex break his aggressive stance, badly disguising his amusement behind her with a growly snort that caused him to receive a baleful glance. The tension was broken completely when Dag suddenly gave a belly laugh and relaxed considerably, the other 2 Krogan stowing their weapons as he did so. You weren't lying when you said this human had some quads, chief, and his Krant aren't spineless cowards either. Clan Urdnot will fight for him as you command. JV Carey suddenly recognized this for what it was, even as the captain grinned and clasped hands with Dag. It was similar in a way to the treaty meetings between Batarian clans, where each side tested the other for weaknesses that could be exploited, but even the most bloodthirsty of clans wouldn't have been quite so brazen in their attempts. The captain spent the next 2 minutes talking with both Rex and Dag off to one side as the rest of the gathered groups calmed down, allowing JV Carey the chance to look around herself. She had to admit, even if only mentally and with a reminder to push her clan harder, the Quarians that had worked on the command deck had done fantastic work in only 3 days. The massive ship command room had effectively been cut in 2, with the half they stood in now remodeled as a grand but functional meeting and communications room. Set in the middle of the unraised area in the middle of the room, where Dag had been standing, was an intricately carved wooden table that almost seemed like it was still alive. It was large enough for a dozen people to sit around it with space to spare, but the key part of it was actually the communications projector that was incorporated into the middle of the table. JV Carey, Eno! Drawn from her thoughts by the call from nearby, JV Carey very quickly focused when she realized she had just been addressed by Spectre Shepard. The projection sat off to her right about halfway up the rows of comfortable-looking seats that rose up on either side of the room. Jane-chan. Good to see you. How are you and the others doing? Officer Yamanaka strode over with the same panache she had shown throughout the Krogan confrontation, seemingly one of the few that hadn't drawn weapons at any point. To JV Carey's surprise, Spectre Shepard smiled at both of them as they walked up and gestured to either side of her, clearly indicating that they should be seated with her. It wasn't a direct order, but memories of what happened on the asteroid prevented JV Carey from trying the same level of impertinence that she had with the captain. While the captain was staying his hand for whatever reason, Spectre Shepard was known to be far more decisive. Spectre, it is an honor. Sitting down next to Spectre Shepard, JV Carey took a moment to understand the panel of controls in front of her. In addition to a pair of small projection panels set into the back of the seat in front of her, which probably would allow her to project specific channels of incoming communications to her seat, there was a camera that would allow her to project herself. We are doing okay, Ino, though I think we are all about ready to get off this station as soon as possible. JV Carey, I know Naruto will have been over this with you. Right now we aren't working, so call me Shepard or Jane. None of this Spectre crap amongst friends. They weren't working? JV Carey could see the executor of CCC and his 3 bodyguards sat across from them, as well as projections of the human ambassador, at least 2 human Navy admirals and a dozen other people that she didn't recognize. These were some of the most politically powerful in the galaxy, and this wasn't classed as work. She had been to clan gatherings that were less populated than this, though she knew at least half of the people gathered were related to the various groups the captain had been recruiting for the ship. Before she could work out how to correctly reply to Spectre Shepard, avoiding being too familiar while still obeying the command she had just been given, 2 more projections appeared further down the row of seats they were currently sat in. Right, everyone seems to be here now, so everyone sit down and let's get this party started. Obviously these late arrivals, 2 middle-aged human males dressed in work jumpsuits, were what the captain seemed to have been waiting for as he moved towards the area at the far end of the room away from them. Dag and the other Krogans seemed to have concluded their business, however, as they headed for the doors back to the elevator without another word. Just as JV Carey was leaning forward to keep him in easy view, a projection of the captain appeared from the projector in front of her. Obviously, there was a dedicated command area for this room that would make sure he could be easily seen, yet another improvement over the very limited communication system that had been present on the ship beforehand. So, first off, apologies in advance if the communication cuts out at any point. Whilst Tervan and his teams have done wonders, this is something of an experimental system we have put in place. If you struggle with anything or the quality isn't perfect, send a message to me afterwards, and we will upgrade the system. There were several sounds of acknowledgement from around the room, though Spectre Shepard remained silent as the captain waited for quiet once more. Now, as you have probably noticed, there are quite a few people here, mostly because there is a lot to cover about quite a few situations. Because quite a bit will be classified, we will cover the colonial situations first, and then move on to other matters after those representatives leave. That explained who some of the projected humans probably were, though why the captain was worrying about some remote colonies was not as easy for JV Carey to immediately grasp. Warren-san, if you can provide a sit rep for Eden Prime first, then we can do Pharaohs before focusing on Terra Nova. As the projection changed to that of a middle-aged human woman with short-cut brown hair, Spectre Shepard shifted into a somewhat more serious posture next to JV Carey. Thank you, Naruto. We have almost 40,000 casualties still requiring intensive medical assistance, mainly long-term injuries from the attack and illnesses that have arisen from poor housing and sanitation. Thanks to the shipment of supplies arranged by yourself and Spectre Shepard, we have managed to restore approximately 10% of the housing units damaged by the Geth assault. While the conditions are not ideal and we are barracking multiple families to the same unit, there is a much more upbeat feeling around the camp than there was 2 months ago. Thank the Maker. Spectre Shepard gave a quiet snort at this point, and when JV Carey looked at her questioningly, the projection pointed across the room to where the human ambassador was looking uncomfortable. We were expecting the first deliveries of aid and support from the Alliance next week, though I assumed that the attack on Terra Nova might lead to delays on that matter? The human woman's tone wasn't angry or accusatory, but given the look on the human ambassador's face, it seemed like she had stabbed his favorite Varen with a rusty shiv. The Alliance is doing everything we can to aid our colonies in their recovery from these attacks, but attacks on such a large scale. The ambassador was cut off by the captain speaking up, his tone friendly but with a small undertone of steel behind it. Udina-san, save the speeches for the press release. None of us have time for grandstanding. I know the Council has been working on a relief package for Terra Nova. Palin Taishu, I realize you are being put on the spot a bit here, but do you know the progress on that point? As the Turian nodded, showing no signs of surprise at being called upon in such a manner, one of the Turians guarding him twitched slightly. The Council has been gathering relief materials on the Citadel, primarily food and medigel, though housing and other construction supplies are proving harder to source. There are approximately 10,000 units of medical supplies that could be shipped today, along with approximately 100,000 meal equivalents of dextro food rations. The captain nodded, but rather than say anything about the offer directly, he pointed out one of the men that had joined the meeting late. We can discuss what is going where once we have an idea of priorities, but I think there is an opportunity to mitigate some of the housing problems on Eden Prime. FAI Dan, if you would? The man nodded before bowing to the room. Thank you, Captain? At the captain's nod, the now named FAI Dan continued. We are only a small colony here on Pharos, but with the recent Geth assault and our new patronage, we have uncovered a very large section of intact Prothean ruins that require stabilizing and exploring. With Exogeni's departure, there are housing and agricultural facilities that could house several thousand people if they don't mind using the existing structures, and I have been instructed to look for at least 1,000 more permanent settlers to help with disassembling enough of the ruins near Zhu's hope to allow for a permanent settlement. This was clearly news to most of the room. Even the captain sat forward with obvious interest, Dr. Warren nodding her head enthusiastically. I can't speak for anyone here on Eden Prime about the permanent settlers, but I know there are a large number of the younger generations that will jump at the opportunity to do something useful while they wait for the farms to be repaired and replanted. Ambassador Udina spoke up once more, J.V. Carey getting the feeling that this particular human might live up to the very low standards most Batarians set for their kind. Of course, any intact artifacts that are recovered are property of the Alliance, given the fact that Exogeni have abandoned the outpost. I am sure that in exchange we can arrange a defense force of some kind. For the first time, Spectre Shepard spoke up from next to her, a polite smile on her face even as she shook her head. Exogeni didn't actually abandon the colony, though given how cheaply they sold the contract for, they certainly were in a rush to get out of there as fast as humanly possible. I will admit that running a colony is more paperwork than I'd like, but that's what I have FAI Dan for. Shepard's smile turned slightly hungry as she glanced around the room before focusing on the ambassador and Executor Palin. Given the Thorian and the Geth remains on Pharos, not to mention what else we will find in the new areas that have been uncovered, I imagine not just the Alliance but the Council will be wanting to send teams to investigate. I'll waive the fees I could charge, in exchange for a decent defense system and a couple of combat trainers to teach the colonists how to shoot properly. J.V. Carey got the feeling that if the ambassador tried to push things or be difficult, anything that would have been interesting would disappear from Pharos long before any one official could land to take stock. Of course, Shepard, the Alliance owes you a great deal of gratitude for saving Terra Nova. I will leave the logistics of such an exchange to you, Captain. The ambassador looked like he had just been forced to swallow Pijak Pudu, but managed to maintain his composure enough to not provoke Spectre Shepard further. Of course, Ambassador. Shepard, I'll be in touch with you separately to discuss scope and logistics. Captain Anderson was one of the few people from off the ship that J.V. Carey recognized, the human having worked closely with both the captain and Spectre Shepard in the aftermath of the Terra Nova attack. Thanks, Anderson. Work through FAI Dan for now. My work calendar is looking rather busy right now. Seemingly finished speaking on that remarkably vague point, Shepard leaned back in her seat once more. I'll take that as my cue to step in. The other human in working coveralls spoke up, stroking probably what once was close-kept facial hair in a somewhat relaxed manner. For those who don't know, my name is Simon Atwell. And given the governor and most of her staff are missing, dead or currently in Alliance custody, I'm the closest thing to a civilian in charge right now. The situation on Terra Nova is not as dire as it could have been, given the potential for my X-57 to have wiped out 90% of the population, but large portions of Scott are still little better than disaster zones. Between the surviving engineers from X-57 and the Alliance crews of the 5th Fleet, about 30% of the more minorly damaged habitation areas have been stabilized and are habitable again, even if some people are complaining about what Commander Rex had referred to as aesthetic-enhancing war decorations. That comment brought a chuckle to most of the room, including a smug-looking Rex whose grin only grew as Nora waved excitedly at him for being mentioned. We will be able to house everyone for now, but the repairs to the commercial centers will effectively be from the ground up. And given that included both of Scott's main hospitals and the colony's central storage facilities, the main shortages we have are medical equipment, personnel, and food supplies. The man nodded his head in the direction of the Alliance Admiral, whose projection had barely shifted since the briefing began, his facing shifting to become somewhat apologetic. No offense to the Alliance's medical staff, they've been working round the clock and have saved more people than I want to guess at. But we need people who are going to stick around for more than 3 weeks, given I am told by Admiral Singh that the majority of his forces will be leaving by the end of this week. The Admiral nodded in confirmation of what was being said, though he didn't seem keen to elaborate on where his fleet would be going. With the confirmation that the last of the known Batarian vessels managed to escape this morning, the 5th Fleet is being redeployed for other operations. I will be leaving 1 cruiser and 3 frigates until Alliance Command can send another wolf pack to act as Terra Nova's defense fleet, in case anyone else gets ideas. The captain didn't have an immediate answer for this particular issue, it seemed, as several of the others gathered in the room joined the conversation in a somewhat chaotic manner. This carried on for several minutes, with various ideas being raised, discussed, and shelved before Spectre Shepard spoke up from where her projection had been frozen, obviously some kind of pause feature that the Quarians had added. Enough. We aren't going to fix the issue today. Everyone can think about it tonight and get back to us. We need to move the meeting on to Spectre matters, before the rest of the Normandy wake up and ask where we are going. As Spectre Shepard sat back to allow the other unclassified people speak, such as the Asari that the captain had hired provisionally to run the shipyard and his other Citadel holdings, Officer Yamanaka spoke across to them quietly. Jane-chan, I thought you were still stuck doing Spectre training? Or are you missing seeing us in person that much? Spectre Shepard didn't respond to the questions verbally, the satisfaction in her smile the only indicator that she had heard her. After the reports on the shipyard, 2 salvage shops, some type of shop that sold something called ramen, and an armorer/weaponsmith on the upper wards, Naruto cut in before the Asari could continue further. Thank you for the detailed review, Nixorus, but we don't need to cover the storage facilities and other assets. Given the new security rules on the Citadel, we will be moving our storage and weapons facilities off station, to prevent any future headaches that may arise. The second part of the captain's statement didn't seem to be aimed at Nixorus for some reason, but J.V. Carey let it go as Nzirus nodded and stepped back. Now, as Jane-chan mentioned, we will be moving on to the next part of the briefing now, so anyone who isn't cleared can take the chance to enjoy whatever time of day it is where they are. For once, everyone acted like J.V. Carey expected, the various civilians and members of the crew either leaving the room or disconnecting from the communicator, though Nzirus and a couple of others seemed to pause before leaving for a second. This left the captain, Spectre Shepard, Officer Yamanaka, Captain Anderson, Rex and his brood, Executor Palin and his 3 guards, the human ambassador and admiral, and a couple of others sat up in the back rows that J.V. Carey couldn't make out the features of for some reason. Even Turvan had left with the other Quarians, causing a small feeling of pride to form in J.V. Carey's stomach, which she quickly crushed before she got ahead of herself. Right, now that we have minimized the risk of leaks, we can get down to business. Gibbs, if you wouldn't mind running through the Batarian attack report, we can then move on to what plans we have for our hegemony problem. One of the Turians that had been sat behind Executor Palin nodded brusquely as the projections in front of everyone switched to him. Given the scale of the attack, as well as the amount of extremely accurate information passed on by our P.I network, we tasked 10 separate teams to unearthing exactly how the Batarians knew where to attack and how they got onto and off the Citadel so easily. Despite closing 4 different smuggler groups down that were linked with the heavy weapons the attackers used, the answers to the latter question were unfortunately very simple. Gibbs didn't elaborate on the reason, but given how Spectre Shepard and the others seemed to nod their heads in understanding, it was just her that was missing the point. Now, before I continue, Commander Shepard. Gibbs leaned forward in his seat, his eyes fixed on the projection sat next to J.V. Carey in a manner that spoke of severity and understanding in equal measure. At the moment, only the executor and 2 members of my team are aware of the person of interest mentioned in this report, and they were only told verbally with no digital references. Given that there has already been one attack based on their identity, are you happy for me to reveal their name and identity? For the first time since J.V. Carey had met Spectre Shepard, her face showed a moment of turmoil and uncertainty rather than the confidence that she normally exuded, though having spent a week on the Will of Fire, J.V. Carey could quite easily guess who was being referred to. I would prefer if we could keep their identity a secret. No offense to your organization, Executor, but between Saren, the Shadow Broker, and the other issues that keep cropping up. Spectre Shepard cut off, however, as the projectors on every occupied seat suddenly changed to show a cloaked figure. One of the ones that J.V. Carey had noticed earlier and then dismissed. Now that she thought about it, why had she ignored? J.V. Carey's recriminations about her lack of awareness would be something she would think of later, as the figure spoke while standing from her seat. If I may command, sister. There was an audible gasp from across the room as the hood was dropped, and given her clan's own reaction to a similar reveal a couple of days before, J.V. Carey couldn't blame them. Despite the jagged and poorly treated scar that started in her hairline and followed her jawline down her face, as well as gaunt features of someone who worked far too long with far too little food, it was almost impossible not to see the similarities between her and Spectre Shepard. I was slave 3721 to 34 of the Sakanak clan. I don't remember a life before that, but my progeny, my mother told me my true name, though I could not speak of it until now. I am Sarah Luna of the Shepard clan, in service of the clan, word and deed. This clearly wasn't planned, as Spectre Shepard looked both furious and proud in equal measure, something that the newly revealed Sarah obviously caught as she bowed her head deferentially. Apologies, sister, for my impertinence, but I refuse to hide in the shadows or try and cast off the shared blood between us. As clan leader Frigger said in The Rise and Fall of Clans, trying to keep secrets not related to battlefield strategy is merely giving the enemy weapons they don't currently know they have. I will try and find a human quote similar for use in future, but my time with the Uzumaki clan has not left a lot of time for such pursuits so far. Sarah seemed to gain confidence as she spoke, every word sounding slightly more certain even as she quoted one of the most revered Batarian texts to have survived their exodus from their homeworld. Spectre Shepard didn't reply immediately, instead leaning forward to cast what J.V. Carey could only assume was a baleful glare down towards the captain. Don't look at me, Jane-chan. I didn't put her up to this, she asked to be here. It seems that your ability to piss off authority figures is genetic. You're just upset that it is happening to you for a change. The fact that Rex nodded and grunted in a "that sounds about right" way merely seemed to be another nail in the coffin. Though even as Spectre Shepard sat back in her seat, and seemed to be building up for an argument of epic proportions, she seemed to deflate suddenly as Sarah was almost knocked from her feet by a Nora-shaped missile. Sarah! You're here! Why didn't you tell me you were here? Were we playing a game of hide and seek again? I don't remember starting one. But I found you, so it's my turn to hide, right? As Sarah weathered Storm Nora with a timid but heartfelt smile appearing on her face, Gibbs coughed somewhat loudly, in a clear attempt to get the meeting back on track. You done? As Sarah nodded in a shy manner, all former confidence gone as she used the one hand free of holding Nora in her lap to cut off her projection to all the different screens, Gibbs started speaking once more. As you have now all been told, the use of Commander Shepard's sister was the bait in the trap intended to eliminate both of them at once. We haven't been able to ascertain who the attackers were or their association with the hegemony beyond the hegemony's original attempt to arrest the commander after the attack. 3 senior members of the Batarian embassy staff have been arrested by Batarian Internal Security, with the official line now being that the claim was not authorized by the hegemony government, and these 3 have been touted as the ringleaders of this terrorist action. Gibbs shook his head at this point, showing his disbelief in the explanation somewhat more openly than J.V. Carey would have expected. We have requested that the ringleaders be handed over to CCC, given we had jurisdiction in this case, but supposedly they all died resisting arrest and their bodies sent back to the hegemony. Given that the Batarians don't even have an official embassy on the Citadel, I've already asked for permission to search the office section they have been using, but I get the feeling the place is being sterilized as we speak. They shouldn't have their own internal security forces aboard the Citadel with the new security rules, so if nothing else CCC can do something on that front. Gibbs was clearly frustrated even as he sat back down, and the captain spoke once more. Told you they weren't stupid, though after the Citadel attack and the attack on Terra Nova they are struggling to keep from implicating themselves on something. I would offer to help dig some things up, but with us trying to track down Benezia through these Sisters of Reflection and their associates I'm busy enough, I think. And given there should be specters running around the hegemony, the Council can work on giving someone else a headache for a change. Gibbs snorted something that sounded like frustrated approval, though the executor and the other CCC guards did not react in a manner that J.V. Carey would consider as amused. Uzumaki. I mean, Captain, I am sure that we don't need to keep dragging the Council's name down like this. I thought that things had been improving between you and them recently. Executor Palin seemed very uneasy as he spoke up, though the captain merely shrugged and gave the same grin he seemed to always give when he knew something other people didn't. Palin-san, I am sure that the Council is above being concerned with any comments I might make. Besides, it isn't like they couldn't offer a rebuttal themselves, if they are finished playing pretend? There was a pause for a moment, as not just J.V. Carey but most of the room looked around in confusion, not quite sure what the captain meant. Then, with a sigh and a soft hiss of a vacuum-sealed disconnection, the Asari guard for Palin removed her helmet, revealing one of the few non-Batarian faces even J.V. Carey could have picked out from a crowd. I would prefer in future if you could be a little more subtle in letting us know you know things. I thought you claimed to be an infiltrator of some type, Operative Uzumaki. Counselor Tevos cast a look down towards the captain that seemed to be even parts annoyance and exasperation. Though as Counselor Sparatus followed with removing his helmet he seemed far less angry and more resigned. What would be the fun in that, Counselor-san? Though, given the 2 of you have snuck aboard my vessel under the guise of guards that Executor Palin has never had before, you should stop slinging double-ended kunai around, counselors. The captain shrugged off the displeasure being thrown his way with his usual broad grin, before moving the conversation on with considerable energy. Well, as the counselors are here, we can move to whether there are any official orders for Jane-chan. I assume the disguises are because you looked into the details of the number of spying and listening devices I told Palin-san were in your council rooms? Counselor Sparatus nodded his head, though given how few Turians J.V. Carey had interacted with before now, his face was quite difficult to read. At least a third of the devices were removed by the time a search was organized, which more helped prove your point about planted agents within CCC than the spying devices themselves. Counselor Desoro is leading the response that is no doubt expected by those behind such items, but he has expressed the desire to shake the tree as the human expression goes. Several of the humans in the room, as well as Executor Palin, reacted negatively to the last statement, even as the captain and Spectre Shepard grinned and leaned forward in almost identical glee. Why didn't you open with that, Sparatus-san? Tell us more. J.V. Carey didn't know why, but the feeling in her lower spine nearly made her shiver and rear up defensively. She got the feeling that there was going to be an addition to the original plan, of visiting a couple of out-of-the-way space stations that just so happened to be known Batarian pirate dens. Chapter 24. Space Stations, Slaves and Commandos. Interior of the Harbinger, Persis Vale Interior, 1900 hours May 10th, 2184. Saren Arturius, ex-Spectre and leader of the Geth. The Asari spies on the Citadel have fallen Spectre, not even against the Uzumaki as was intended, but against one of their own pawns who refused to play their role. Survivors taken by CCC for questioning. The voice, deep and accompanied with a slight hum that was reminiscent of an electrical system's interference, had become a familiar if not entirely welcome presence in Saren's mind over the last several years. Which is disappointing, but was only ever intended as a distraction. Chasing the Sisters of Reflection into Asari space will require considerable time and resources for Shepard and her group, given the Council will not be willing to use any of their other specters to investigate such a tenuous link to my activities. Our work to find the conduit, as well as building our forces for taking the Citadel, is far more important than dealing with these annoyances following in our wake. That wasn't actually Saren's view entirely. Personally, he would have preferred to lure the Normandy and this new capital ship that Uzumaki was using into a trap and deal with them, especially given how much was still unknown about the Uzumaki's skills and powers. But if he wanted to prove the usefulness of organics to Harbinger, and through it the rest of the Reapers, he needed to be focused on their goals. Acceptable outcome: links to your direct underling already removed from digital records, and the conditioning of the leader of these sisters will have her claim credit for their actions. She will expire before giving up any information about the matriarch. The casual manner in which Harbinger discussed discarding another of their numerous contacts was slightly off-putting to Saren even now, after almost 6 months of hemorrhaging his Citadel contacts one after another. He knew that the Reaper didn't view organic life as anything other than a resource to be utilized, but it did make him worry about his own position in the long term. I will still have Benezia send a small team, to make sure there is no physical evidence that might tie the sisters to Noveria or Vermeer. It is better to be cautious at this stage of the plan, and Shepard has had too much success already. In fact, Saren was annoyed at the fact Shepard and Uzumaki hadn't turned up 10 years earlier. If they had, he might have decided to act differently when he first found out about the Reaper threat. Though it was definitely too late to be regretting that. Agreed, given reports of Uzumaki working with Citadel forces to investigate numerous bugs and spying equipment used against Council, there should be some time for covering all necessary angles. Reports of Shepard and team seen on Citadel as well, working on something else, no indication of what that is. It had surprised Saren that Harbinger relied as much on communications and dead drops from his indoctrinated minions as he did any technological system or bug software. The Reapers were a vastly advanced race after all. But the Reaper had somehow sensed his confusion and had sent the mental equivalent of a shrug. If someone were to find such software, even if they didn't understand it, the advances it could potentially lead to would make the cycle more difficult in the long term. Such risks weren't worth it given the alternatives that could be used instead. But both of them are on the Citadel, meaning they can't interfere with any of our operations for the time being. Again, what Saren said didn't actually match up with his internal thoughts. He had spent several years developing a series of contacts and resources on the Citadel, as well as sabotaging CCC procedures and resources in a more oblique fashion, so that the eventual invasion of the Citadel would be easier. Shepard's actions in hunting down the larger gangs and less subtle mercenary groups had removed most of these resources from Saren's grasp without her seemingly realizing she had done so. And unlike Harbinger's single-minded belief that this conduit would allow him to take over the Citadel easily with overwhelming force, his experiences as a Spectre were bitter reminders of why placing all his hopes on a single method or plan wasn't exactly sound strategic thinking. Still, nothing would come of trying to push that point, and even with a new ship the pesky remnant wouldn't be a threat compared to the masses of Geth and Harbinger itself. They'd have to gather an entire fleet to be anything more than an annoyance in the long run, and Saren would make sure there wouldn't be time for that. $% and *_+. Gerartex Pirate Space Station, Unnamed Asteroid Cluster 10 o'clock May 14, 2184. Naruto Uzumaki, Captain of the Burning Leaf and Spectre's soldier. Command deck is secured, and as I've not heard anything I assume this settles our little contest dag? Grabbing the rather battered Batarian that seemed to have been in charge of the station, judging by the fact he'd been doing most of the shouting and ordering when they breached the ramshackle security door to the command section. Naruto hauled him away from the consoles and tossed him none too gently down next to the others his clones had dealt with before stretching his arms out to the side. Despite the promise of shaking the tree on the Citadel, the initial stages of that job had quickly turned into electronic hacking and passive espionage work, not exactly Naruto's preferred jobs if he could avoid it. So in the name of delegation, as he had been advised by his allies to actually understand rather than merely use against others, Naruto had given up the boring stuff and done a bit of conspiring with Jane to work out what on their grand list he should look at next. Given the Burning Leaf was still nowhere near combat ready, Naruto eventually decided to use his portion of the prize money that the Alliance had credited him to put a down payment on the least damaged of the Batarian frigates they'd captured in the battle for Terra Nova. While it had many of the same problems the Burning Leaf had regarding crew-heavy operational requirements, it served the purposes as a cover for the purposes of this little side job perfectly. We are nearly at the station's engine core, Captain, though I would protest that your insistence on allowing people to surrender slowed us down. Given the Normandy was chasing down the leads on the Asari Sisterhood that had been spying on him, and Kasumi delegated to support the efforts digging out more of the corruption and espionage groups on the Citadel, Naruto wasn't waiting for the refit of the Burning Leaf to be complete to carry on with what Jane had rather amusedly stated was his empire-building mission. And I imagine a dozen Krogan rampaging through the halls made convincing them to do so difficult. Alina, Mari, any issues securing the docks? Garartex Station wasn't more than a minor refueling and resupply station hidden amongst the asteroid cluster that was relatively close to Terra Nova, but it didn't appear on any official map or documentation. If Alina hadn't had the intel on it from her mercenary days, then there was no way they would have ever found it. But it had been chosen as the target for two very particular reasons. Its size was such that it could only deal with 2 or 3 ships docking at a time, and would only have a couple of hundred crew at best. And its location, given the current fervor of Alliance ships in the near side of the terminus, meant that its traffic would be minimal. So it had been child's play to have one of JV Carey's seconds pretend to be the captain of the ship as it evaded the Alliance search patterns, the partially repaired battle damage only helping to sell the story as they moved to dock. The welcome party meant to extort a tax on the ship's cargo in return for fuel and supplies didn't last more than 30 seconds. Dag and the other Urdnot Krogan that Rex had recruited/called to arms clearly enjoying their chance to prove themselves to their new employer. Hangar 1 secure, more than a dozen slaves here that were more than happy to help secure their former masters. The rest are too cowed to do more than carry out menial tasks. Alina and Shirala had led a team of the Glavkar Batarians to secure the other ship dock that had been occupied, a Batarian model transport ship approximately half again the size of the Ontario. It seemed their guess as to what at least part of that cargo had been was bang on. Couple of rather desperate stragglers attempted to try and board the ship. Ino dealt with them easily enough. Permission to search for any stragglers deeper in the station? While that would sound like a physical search to anyone on the line, Mari's spores would be able to search the station far quicker than even his clones would be able to. Do it, split anyone who clearly isn't here under duress from the slaves and other workers, check for any Citadel or Alliance bounties we can call in. I'll head back to the ship and call in the Alliance. Admittedly, Naruto did want to get hold of a space station of his own at some stage, but there was no way the forces he had brought with him would be able to navigate this thing to Terra Nova, let alone run the thing once it was settled. Well, that and the fact that the Garartex wasn't that much bigger than the Burning Leaf, so a bigger station would be needed in the end to service the flagship effectively. Naruto was personally intrigued by the idea of the asteroid the Terra Novan colonists were going to mine out for their own space station. Certainly it would allow them to pick somewhere that wasn't going to be on a major traffic route. Understood, Captain. See you shortly. The trip back through the station was uneventful, several clones and Glavkar members working to skin the bodies of the station's security force and herd the workers into the rather cramped living quarters where any damage they could do was minimized. Hopefully the promise of freedom from the slave caste and the words of the Glavkar members would get through to some of the slave caste Batarians here. Certainly more than one group Naruto passed were holding huddled discussions in the Batarian native language. Captain, a moment? Looking up and seeing JV Carey waving him over as she stood with 3 Batarians that were far too underfed and poorly clothed to have come with them from the Citadel. Carey-chan. How can I help? It was a phrase that still made her and the other Glavkar members uncomfortable when he used it, and that was nothing compared to the gathered Batarians. You requested that I find the leader of the slave caste clan on the station, but it seems that this station isn't maintained by a single slave caste clan as such. Many of those here were offered from the ships they serve on in return for fuel and materials, and are regularly bartered in turn by the station's overseers to supply ships returning to the hegemony. These 3 are among the longest-serving members on the station that were prepared to talk with me. Turning his gaze to the 3 mentioned, Naruto noted with a slightly sickened feeling that while JV Carey and her clan were treated as expendable cannon fodder, off the battlefield they were seemingly treated better than these poor souls. The oldest of the 3 slaves was a veritable map of scar tissue and other old wounds, the left half of his face a single large burn that looked less like an accident and more like a message. The woman of the trio was dangerously thin and looked like she might bolt at any moment, her hands trembling even as she held them in what Naruto now understood was the Batarian version of a submissive greeting. The last of them was small enough that Naruto could only hope that he was a dwarf adult, missing 3 fingers from his right hand and with a desperate anger in his eyes that Naruto recognized from amongst the shinobi during the last months of the Metal Man invasion. "Thank you, Carey-chan. Please escort them to the ship and get them settled in the conference room? I'm sure we can rustle up some food and drinks while they wait for me to be finished here?" Looking around the large area that seemed to serve as a central transit area on the station as JV Carey started to translate what he had said to the others, Naruto noticed there were at least 30 or 40 other Batarians in a similar state to the 3 in front of him. Compared to the civilian workers, who were all dressed in void suits or light armor including helmets, the slave caste were dressed in simple boiler suits or similar heavily worn overalls and work gear that in nearly every case was clearly billowing on them. Given the small but constant risk of a structural failure on rough and ready stations like this, the clear disregard for the lives of the slave caste members was another insight on Batarian society that Naruto was not enjoying delving into. Actually, get the crew to raid this place's stores and get some of our supplies as well. While waiting for the Alliance to get here, we can settle some nerves here and hopefully convince this lot we aren't bad guys. As JV Carey translated this to the 3, the elder's 2 working eyes lit up and the short Batarian seemed to relax a little, pointing and barking out something that had the other slave castes begin moving over towards them as the woman shook her head rapidly and gestured in his direction. 67211 says the workers will begin to gather the supplies with your permission, Captain. I will handle this, if you can send Quartermaster Badia to help with medical assistance? Judging by the expression on JV Carey's face, she wanted to discuss other matters that she didn't want him present for, another part of Batarian's slave caste culture he didn't quite understand. Still, if she wanted to handle things he wouldn't say no, so he gave a quick salute and his usual smile. "You're the boss, Carey-chan." The gasp from the female slave, not to mention JV Carey's frustrated growl, made him chuckle even as he jogged away. Nirali would probably tell him he was taking completely the wrong approach with his attempts to break JV Carey and the Galkvar clan of their ingrained mannerisms and habits, but he'd never been one to conform to standard procedures. The 30 Quarians that had helped run the frigate to get them here were already at work in the hangar claiming equipment and materials that could be used for further repairs and modifications. But unlike the Quarians from the Ontario, who not only knew who they were signing up under but also about the more combat-related parts of their role, they were clearly not comfortable handling blood and bodies. Something to have an informal chat with the rest of the Quarians he'd hired for the Burning Leaf when he got back. He wouldn't fire anyone with qualms, of course. He had enough spaces in the shipyard, or even in the relief efforts for the colony to fill. But for the more serious fights with Saren and the Geth to come, they couldn't afford to have someone become squeamish or freeze up in a combat zone. Naruto-kun. Ino had no such qualms, of course, as she helped one of Galkvar Batarians lift one of the dead bodies onto a grav gurney, the body still in the clearly threadbare combat armor that was as much for show as it was any use in combat. Ino-chan, here you took down a couple of these guys yourself? Completely happy with the new leg at last? Given said leg was the third one Ino had tried, the other 2 failing under the rather harsh conditioning she had put herself through to get back to normal, it was a valid question. Tali, bless her, had already been drawing up schematics for a prototype with a bit more versatility to it. But given the hectic schedule of back-to-back missions the Normandy had been on since, they hadn't had time to sit down and talk it through further. Not really, damaged the knee joint when I used some taijutsu on the biggest of the 3 that tried to get through. Still functional though, so I'll take that as a win for now. Ino shook her head even as she moved over to join him at the entrance to the ship, a noticeable limp in her stride combined with a grinding of metal on metal that was clearly getting worse, not better. At this rate you'll need half a dozen models, just for spares to change into while we repair the others. My poor bank balance. Both of them laughed easily, something that made Naruto's spirit rise as the previous awkwardness about his guilt and Ino's mixture of frustration and grief seemed to have faded enough that they could both move past it. So, are we calling the Alliance to collect their prize? Or checking in on your grand deception first? There was no question of if Ino was meant to join him or not, though anyone who knew the Yamanaka, clan head he now supposed wouldn't have been surprised. He imagined the idea that he might want to take those calls alone hadn't even entered her mind. Alliance first, then we can check in on Jane-chan and the others on the Citadel, while waiting for the cavalry. With the clear evidence that Saren still had agents and informants aplenty on the Citadel, it had been agreed with the council that a little deception was permissible, to prevent any warning that the rather imminent strike headed towards the Sisters of Reflection was coming from getting out. As far as nearly everyone aboard the Citadel knew, Jane and the Normandy were on the Citadel investigating the Sisters' attack and trying to gather more information related to Saren from the council. Jane and the Normandy had in fact docked with the Citadel the day after the overall conference they'd had a few days before, but they'd been on station only long enough to get fuel and supplies, as well as dropping Zavina back to CSCC for debriefing. Then, with stealth drive active, they'd departed without anyone the wiser, the mass of traffic to and from the Citadel meaning no one even noticed the additional splash that their transit jump had caused. Since then, his clones on the Citadel had spent time as each member of the strike team, and even some of the ship's crew, to sell to anyone still watching that the Normandy was nowhere it might be considered a threat. And given Shinobi Shipbuilding's internal network was still entirely disconnected from the main Citadel network, there was very little chance of their ruse being discovered through electronic means, at least for the time being. Ah crap. As they reached the elevator to the captain's quarters, to which the main communications terminal was attached, Ino's leg seemed to give up its losing battle to maintain structural integrity and function. Ino's entire body dropped more than 2 inches, as her right leg noticeably shortened with a pained screech, though Naruto had grabbed and steadied her before she lost her balance entirely. I think we are going to have to teach you to fight with your hands more in future, Ino-chan. The female ninja thought about it for a moment before giving him another flirty smirk, as her arms looped around his neck and she lifted herself onto his back. And stop giving you the opportunity to carry me off in your arms? Never. I admit the fact you keep taking me to your room when you do has definitely given me ideas. Naruto didn't even groan as the now familiar weight shifted in place for a moment. Ino insisted she had to get comfortable in a way that seemed to involve pressing her chest very firmly into his back. He was just glad this time they'd already made it to the elevator, and therefore there wouldn't be any witnesses. Many of the crew on all 3 ships were still telling jokes about the first time Ino's leg had failed mid-spar. Temple of Ascended Thoughts, Haishiana, Asari-controlled space, May 15, 2184. Jane Shepard, Council Spectre. Well, this is a nice change of scenery compared to where you normally take us, Commander. Gurus' comment, about the rather picturesque surroundings and elegant building complex they were near the entrance of, brought a laugh to Jane's lips even as Tali dove into the alcove across from her with a sarcastic continuation. Shame about the locals though, it's really going to drop my trip score review rating. Leaning out of the alcove, Tali unleashed a sabotage on one of the Asari currently shooting at them, the Asari not ducking back into cover even as her pistol overheated and her shield failed under the attack. Given the whole Asari-only rule this cult seemed determined to stick to, I don't think you're going to worry them too much, Tali. Jane's comment was punctuated by another series of gunshots off in front of them to one side, no doubt from where one of the other assault teams was at work. Unlike the preconception she'd had when she first heard the name of this place, it was not a single massive structure shaped like a pyramid or something equally ostentatious. Instead, the temple used by the Sisters of Reflection was a building complex of multiple hostel-like buildings interspersed with local flora around several larger central buildings with multiple landing areas around the exterior. All the buildings were squat single or double-floored open space affairs, which had made sneaking in an impossibility, which was why they hadn't tried. With the Normandy overhead, cutting off any chance of an aerial escape, while Presley notified Haitiana Space Control of their arrival and Shepard's mission, Jane and the others had landed using the small transport that had been transferred from the Burning Leaf on the Citadel. It had been a couple of minutes before they encountered the first sister, gardening with a set of secateurs, but the moment she saw them the seeming tranquility she had been exuding vanished and was replaced with a murderous rage. Still, gardening tools and other rudimentary weapons had been little help against the strike team, who had kept to non-lethal attacks for the most part on her orders. The strange rage effect, as well as the way in which nearly 80% of the Asari here hadn't even tried to fall back to better equip and arm themselves, was something that Jane wanted investigated as soon as possible. Eno's preliminary mind scans of the sisters captured on the Citadel had pointed to some kind of brainwashing, on a level both in depth and complexity she had never encountered before, but they need a lot more subjects in order to analyze its effects and whether it can be reversed. All teams check in. Any sign of this matriarch Siax? According to the captured sisters, she is the leader of this group, and the one who commanded them to the Citadel. The three of them hadn't seen anyone that seemed to particularly stand out as a matriarch, but there might not be a visual indicator that made things that easy. Encountering heavy resistance, this group clearly aren't sisters. Cadence down but stable. The rather frantic call from Ashley deflated the three's good humor like a lead balloon, even as Rex growled that his team was doing fine despite the no-killing preference she had emphasized before they landed. Rex, keep clearing? Ashley, moving to support now. Gesturing for Tali to hold position, in case this was an attempt to break the semi-encirclement to allow for an escape attempt. Jane charged a throw with an ease that would have amazed herself a year ago. The two Asari that had been attempting to pin them down were dealt with in seconds, Jane trusting in her barrier as she ran forwards. The time for taking things carefully was over. You better hurry, Commander. I've managed to pull Caden back, but the 4 Marines with us are down. At least 3 Asari, tactical gear and advanced biotics. Either some kind of secret guard then, or something arranged by Saren as some kind of surprise. Nearly there, Garen, I need a step. Slowing down, so that the Turian could first catch up with her and then overtake her, Shepard kept moving towards the base of the large stone wall that separated the areas of the compound. Ashley's dot on the minimap was moving backwards slowly, almost directly away from her, but given the 3 red dots that were closing rapidly, there wasn't time to head to one of the gaps in the wall, so it was time for a bit of improvisation. Garrus seemed to understand her intent, dropping to one knee at the base of the wall, using his sniper rifle as a support to steady himself as she powered forward. Her first step took her up a small stepped wall around a raised bed to one side of the path, giving her the boost she needed to get her other foot up to the top of Garrus' back. Even as her momentum carried her forward, Garrus surged upwards to standing, forcing her leap higher than even she had expected. That wasn't to say she magically cleared a 2.5-meter wall like those hollow movies like to exaggerate, but she collided with it at about waist height. The collison hurt like a bitch, but her hands steadied her before she either flipped overhead first or slipped back down. Flipping one leg over, Jane braced herself as she reached down to pull Garrus up, something she knew her muscles were going to be complaining about for the next couple of days. Garrus pulled himself up next to her and didn't even settle before reaching to unhook his sniper rifle from his back. Get going, Commander, I'll draw their attention. The wall they were currently straddling was the tallest thing in the area, the trees and bushes all well maintained to less than 2 meters or so. That meant they could clearly see the 3 black armored Asari commandos, as there were few other forces in the galaxy that would have been able to counterattack so efficiently, as they poured fire and biotic abilities towards what Jane could only assume was Ashley's cover. No, wait for my signal. Dropping down from the wall, it was only 30 meters or so between Jane and the nearest commando, but she wanted to close the distance as much as possible. A prolonged firefight with the Asari equivalent of the N7 wasn't exactly appealing. There was no shout or macho banter. Such was the sounds of the fighting that Jane's arrival was announced with a shotgun round at less than 3 meters into the commando's back. The impact forced the commando from her feet, though she was well trained enough to turn it into a roll that allowed her to somewhat tank Jane's follow-up throw as well. The throw kept the commando off balance, however, and there was nothing she could do to stop the double-footed slide that knocked her off her feet even as she tried to stand. The second shotgun round tore out the commando's midsection even as she hit the floor, but that didn't stop Jane from getting hit by a last gasp warp that was strong enough to nearly overwhelm her barrier, and forcing herself to one knee. The burst of assault rifle fire that shattered it made it clear the other commandos knew she was there. Now, ducking behind a hedge, which served more as a sight break rather than anything else, the telltale thwop of a sniper rifle round impacting armor shielding came from closer than Jane thought it would, meaning. Rolling forward, Jane felt the biotic charge that would have caught her completely off guard as it buffeted the rear of her armor, slamming into the base of a statue of what she assumed was Asari art. It looked like a 3D impression of a paint spill, but Jane had never claimed to be cultured. The commando that had charged her clearly had overheated her assault rifle, as she closed with an elegant-looking stiletto blade and another biotic charging on her free arm. Jane, however, had no intention to deal with the situation honorably, however, and activated the grenade that she had dropped when she rolled. The blast wave hurt like a bitch, and her shields failed with a cascade of whines, but the commando suffered far worse, having stood pretty much next to it. Sitting there and basking in the fact she had just successfully taken down 2 commandos was really tempting, and the grogginess of her head meant it took precious seconds before she remembered there could well be more of them. Luckily, it was at that point that the ringing in her ears decreased, and she could make out what Garrus had unintelligibly been murmuring through the comms to her. "Last commando is down, Shepard. Couldn't decide whether to turn and face me or try and break through to Ashley. You still in one piece?" Looking back over to the wall, Jane saw him give a cheeky wave before averting his eyes to scan the area again as she gave him the middle finger with the hand that hurt slightly less. Apparently that gesture was universal, at least. "Normandy, need evac for wounded on my position." Oh yeah, even standing was painful, despite the fact that her armor had already dispensed Medigel on the worst of her injuries. "Make it a full insertion, Shepard. Found our missing matriarch. Those other Asari killed her and the remaining sisters before they tried to bug out. Mission's a scrub." Rex's annoyance was easy to hear, but it matched Jane's own as she did her best to think things through. The death of the matriarch was a major blow, but the fact these commandos were here meant that Saren was worried they might discover something, and the fact they had tried to break the perimeter meant. "Normandy, contact Haitiana Space Command and get a list of the new arrivals and transport planetside in the last week or so." Because even if Saren did have the Geth to do his unsubtle work, Asari commandos were not a cheap disposable asset he would have in abundance. Which meant that there should be a ship either on Haitiana or in orbit that would be waiting to take them back to wherever they had come from beforehand. Chapter 25, Prizes and Paperwork. Grace of the Matriarch Transport Ship, Haitiana, Asari-controlled space, May 16, 2184. Jane Shepard, Council Spectre. This is Commander Shepard to Haitiana Orbital Command. Grace of the Matriarch is secured and crew restrained and ready for processing. No major injuries, over. Jane did her best to keep her frustration at the formal way of speech she was having to use, but it had become very clear on contacting the Asari government in charge of Haitiana that such an attitude was required to ensure that they could proceed in anything like a timely fashion. Understood, Spectre. Please ensure the Grace is removed from orbit by 1800 hours Council hours, or a fine for overextending the docking permit will be issued to you as its new owner. Justicar Liesa is once more requesting that you maintain your presence on Haitiana for the next 48 hours until she can arrive to support your investigation. Shepard resisted the frustrated chuckle that rose in her throat as she considered the impossibility of the 2 requests she had just been given. Given the relatively light service and space ops crew the Normandy had, in part due to its secretive prototype status as well as her focus on bulking up her ground operations forces, there were only 5 people who were actually rated to fly an orbital transport like the Grace. Joker was out, obviously. Getting him over would be logistically challenging, and the Ascari-style ship layout was not built with his issues in mind. Presley was technically the one in charge of the Normandy right now, so if she wanted him here she'd have to go back and deal with the literal swarm of officials and politicians from Haitiana directly. She'd prefer to deal with Joker complaining about being forced to abandon the Normandy. Caden was in the medbay undergoing surgery and probably needed evac to the Citadel, or an Alliance facility ASAP. His armor had caught most of the rounds that made it through his shields. But that just meant he was suffering from half a dozen broken ribs and internal bleeding from the concussive force of the impact rather than Kia like the Marines who'd been accompanying him. So that just left her and surprisingly Rex as options, the Krogan warlord having owned or used dozens of such craft in his time as a mercenary bounty hunter. Understood, Haitiana Command. The Grace will be undocked and headed to the gate by then. Please log the paperwork for the ship as part of my investigation with the standard Spectre classification and encryption. I will be headed back to the temple now to join my strike team, Spectre Shepard out. She trusted the Spectre system of discretion about as far as she could throw Rex given how easily Saren had received the information about the debacle on Eden Prime, and now that the Council had revealed their issues with cybersecurity it had only dropped lower. But trying to stop them from logging herself as a Spectre would only prompt questions and perhaps even cause them to try and detain them under suspicion that she was a fraud or similar. All Jane could hope Saren no longer had active access to such channels, so their deception wouldn't be revealed before they had a chance to capitalize on it. Standing up from the pilot's chair, Jane took the opportunity to stretch her entire body, the repeated actions of the last 24 hours causing her muscles to stiffen and complain even as her head throbbed in a manner that, while manageable with the drugs Dr. Chukwas had given her, did nothing to improve her friendly disposition. The Grace of the Matriarch was quite literally the smallest gate-capable production transport in Council space, popular for those that had the need to travel from system to system but didn't have the cash to own a proper ship. That meant that there were literally millions of them jumping back and forth through Council space, and therefore went pretty much unnoticeable to naval forces more adept at finding and hunting pirate frigates. It was small enough that there was only one chair in the cockpit, and the living area in the ship was barely the size of the operations deck on the Normandy, crew and visitor quarters included. She stepped out into the living quarters, where the 4 Asari that had been hired as the crew were under armed guard, the communications with Space Control having been broadcast throughout the living area to ensure that she didn't have to repeat it to her team. So Shepard, who drew the unlucky straw of having to stay here. Her team were similarly frustrated, most of them having to step in at various stages when Shepard had been recovering or when they were protecting the Sisters HQ from being swarmed by Asari law enforcement. So Gur's question wasn't surprising, to her at least. It echoed the viewpoint all of them had currently, to get the hell away from here as soon as possible. Even Liara was looking thoroughly put out with the situation, and the Asari's diplomatic approach and somewhat delicate bureaucratic skills were the only reasons someone hadn't started shooting yet. Rex, Ashley and Tali will take as few crew as is necessary to get this thing to the Citadel. Caden will transfer along with the good doctor. The rest of us are staying here until we are sure we have as much information as is needed. There was a round of groans at this, which she ignored in place of giving her instructions to the 3 she had just named. Ashley, you're in charge of getting Caden into Alliance hands and handling any paperwork required. In addition, I need you to coordinate with Anderson and Ambassador Udina. They were going to allocate us some additional strike team resources, but I hadn't heard anything before we left to come here. Contact Naruto if you need support. Normally that would be Caden or Presley's role, but Ashley was the best of the remaining resources she had, and would be less objecting about some of her next instructions. Understood, Shepard. Are there any instructions for Naruto other than for him to continue causing havoc? Jane thought about it for a moment before shaking her head. Naruto was a resource best left to his own devices, and it had been proven early on that trying to control or muzzle him was at best a challenging and somewhat fruitless endeavor. No, though, coordinate with Kasumi directly if you can find her, see how the shakedown is going. I'd prefer any targets were dealt with by us rather than CCC directly. With our main economic supporter going on a bit of an armada building spree, I want to start building a bit of an independent war chest again. We'll move the less obvious valuable items from the temple to the Grace before you need to leave and the Justica arrives. It wasn't like the few surviving members of the Sisterhood would be needing them anymore, and the Asari bureaucracy was annoying her enough that some unauthorized contraband was an amusing way of tweaking their nose. In her opinion anyway. Assume I'm handling sourcing some upgraded armor and weapons while our resident little hacker is working on the ship's data drives, Shepard? assuming that she doesn't get distracted by the first human warlord with the quads to actually back up his boasts. There was a less than friendly elbow to Rex's ribs as Tali took offense at his. Well, Jane couldn't even call it an insinuation anymore. Bashtet. I'm already running a few programs to break the encryptions on the ship's logs, Shepard, but this is some advanced coding compared to what you would expect on this type of ship. I don't want to rush this given I can see some Geth code here. Whole thing could turn into a virus-ridden bomb. Not a reassuring statement, but Tali's caution about Geth tech was one of the reasons she was such a key member of the team. Understood, Tali. Take your time and be careful. In fact, get Naruto to help remove the main computer and isolate it when you get to the Citadel. He mentioned something about setting up a couple of isolation areas for exactly this kind of thing. And that such an event would put the adorably shy Quarian in an isolated, soundproofed room with a man of her very unsubtle affections? Shepard wasn't settled enough in her own feelings to be able to justify to herself physically locking them in a maintenance bay together, but this was only 1 or 2 steps down from doing so. If this didn't give Tali the opportunity she was so desperately looking for, Jane didn't know what would count instead. Still, such levity wasn't the important thing to focus on right now, as this mission had been the first since Eden Prime to have a body count. And yes, Rex, this has highlighted that allowing you all to keep to standard armor and weapons isn't going to cut it, let alone the Marines and their mass-produced armor. The bitterness that entered Jane's voice at this point wasn't entirely aimed at the Alliance but somewhat herself as well. The Alliance had an excuse, which was that they were outfitting an entire army, and the average Marine wasn't going to be expected to combat an Asari commando even on a squad level. Jane had gotten too complacent in how she approached missions, too used to her small teams of specialists being enough to deal with their enemies, and the Marines just needing to clean up in their wake. She didn't have Naruto as a renewable manpower resource and bullet shield anymore, and she refused to accept that deaths were going to be an acceptable outcome of regular missions going forward. Talk to Anderson and use your own contacts. I will contact the Council personally when we are finished here. We have been putting most of our excess funds into supporting Eden Prime, Pharaohs, and Terra Nova, so we need cash and we need it quickly. The moment Tali gets a location, we will chase down wherever these commandos came from. The sting of her headache was returning, but she ignored it as she gave Rex a very serious look. There's enough scum hiding in dark places of the galaxy, and it's time we really started making life difficult for more of them. Shinobi Shipbuilding Company Corporate Offices, The Citadel, 1600 hours, May 18th, 2184. Naruto Uzumaki, Captain of the Burning Leaf and Spectre's soldier. Taxes sucked. Naruto had never had to deal with them before, as Gigi had managed his money as a child and genin pay was automatically taxed before it even reached him. But now he'd stepped out from the shadow of Jane's Spectre status and been rather open about being the new owner of Shinobi Shipbuilding Co. Naruto was quickly finding that simply buying a business, or half a dozen, was not the simple way to make profits that he'd imagined. At least, not without shelling out extortionate fees to a small army of lawyers, accountants, and other specialists that Naruto had viewed previously as money-based corporate bloodsuckers. His opinion hadn't changed, but he now understood at least why they were considered useful. Between land, income, and Citadel support taxes, not to mention the more specific shipyard and storage facility taxes that had supposedly been pushed through by the Volus centuries ago, Naruto was starting to get a little worried about whether his little empire would be able to survive without regular injections of cash from elsewhere. Counselor DeZoro has arrived with some guests, sir. Should I send them up? Speak of one of his sources of supplemental income, and they shall appear, though Naruto had very mixed feelings about the Solarian counselor at the moment. The amphibian had been the one to raise the issue of the legitimacy of Naruto's businesses with him, after Naruto had met with him about shaking the tree, something that Naruto saw as both a helpful piece of advice and a subtle threat. While DeZoro had given the warning as a helpful gesture that had given Naruto time to start this seemingly mountainous slog, it also showed that the Solarian was far more aware about how to potentially threaten him into line compared to the other counselors. Send them up, Nixorus, and then if you can find me the tax forms for the shipyard from last year, and send them to Shirala, that will be it for today. Get yourself home and enjoy the weekend. Honestly, Naruto thought his assistant had already gone home, given that it was approaching 1600 hours Galactic Standard Time, 1, and she was almost as early to the shipyard offices as he was most days. Of course, sir, just a couple more messages I need to respond to regarding the time and agenda for your interview with Emily Wong. Have a good weekend, sir. The reminder of another negative related to having stepped out of the shadows as a more public figure nearly made Naruto bang his head against his desk in frustration, but he shelved thinking about it for now, and just added it to his ever-growing list of things to think about later. It took barely a minute for the elevator to his office to ding, enough time for Naruto to get his 4th or 5th cup of tea of the day, announcing the arrival of Counselor Dezoro and his small entourage. Since getting back from the space station raid, Dezoro had become almost a daily visitor, so Naruto already had his preferred drink ready to hand to him as the counselor walked in. "Counselor, I didn't know we were meeting today, and if I'd known you were bringing guests I would have stocked up some Tapari." Handing the counselor his drink, a mixture of Tavam and fruit juice, Naruto saw Dezoro's face broaden into a smile even as he accepted the drink, and waved off the code Naruto used with the other. "Visit unexpected, you say, but stocked fresh juice judging by delivery note on secretary's desk. Suppose given circumstances the possibility of visit is a sound assumption. No need for Tapari or other codes, all companions are aware of what to be discussed here, required for their positions." That surprised Naruto. The council had been cracking down on data security for weeks now, and that had only accelerated with the revelations of the number of spying bugs in their chambers. "This is Dalatras Ashiel, Deputy Counselor for Solarians on Citadel. Here as introduction prior to temporary replacement of my position on Council. Need to complete tour of Solarian colonies now position on the Council is secure." Other Dalatras nervous about male holding such important rank given failures of predecessor. The female Solarian, dressed in a relatively plain white robe/armor suit, didn't wait for a second before tagging her own comment to the end of Dezoro's. Yes, Valen was embarrassment to Solarians, both in lack of strategic thinking and putting own political desire ahead of unified benefit for all. Saw your encounters with Council, need better understanding of subtlety of politics but agree with Counselor Dezoro's assessment. You use bluntness to shield your deeper thinking and to fool opponents. Look forward to working with you, Uzumaki. It seemed Ashiel was trying to make a good impression, but Naruto could see a cold and calculating look in her eyes even as they shook hands. She would be an ally as long as it worked in the interests of both herself and the Solarian race, something he would have to keep in mind as they moved forward. It was good to know, but Naruto's mind was still whirling as he tried to envision what angle the Solarians were looking for with this metaphorical engagement. Looking forward to it as well, though hopefully my days of contention with the Council are over now, other than with Counselor Spiratus, of course. I could probably save the Citadel, and he'd complain about the damage I'd caused doing it. The poor joke brought a snort of amusement from all of the Solarians regardless. Ashiel then gestured to the other two Solarians as Dezoro stepped to one side, clearly content with letting her now take the lead. Dezoro has informed of your combative nature to authority amongst other issues with Council. But actions against the Geth and Batarians make you powerful, influential and independent figure, despite clear links to Alliance and Spectre Shepherd. No speciesism in actions or words. In fact, Uzumaki Alliance is considered pivotal example of interracial cooperation, but clear absence of Solarians amongst key personnel. Suddenly it all made sense, even as the first of the two unknown Solarians stepped forwards and extended a hand, while the other moved to salute in a far more militaristic manner. Lieutenant Tolan and Scientist Wicks of STG. Given threat of Geth and unknown battleship and weapons technology, science and research more useful than direct combat assistance. We know you will be reticent, but the strategic opportunity is not. Ashiel's attempt to justify the benefits of such an offer was cut off as Naruto raises a hand imperiously, having spent enough time investigating the history of the Council races to know exactly what had caused this sudden diplomatic attempt. And what is attempting to be hidden, ignored, buried? You speak of strategic benefits and logic, which I understand is very much the Solarian approach to negotiations and even to cultural exchanges. But there is a reason that Solarians are considered unreliable as allies throughout Council space on anything but singular, personal levels. Counselor Dezoro flinches slightly at the accusation, but Ashiel merely stood stoically, highlighting in clear contrast who had been the driving force behind this almost uncharacteristically blunt approach. And the timing, just after the news of my new ties with Clan Rex and our first mission together. It's only natural to question whether this is an attempt to join a multi-species initiative to stop the work of the Geth and Saren. Naruto couldn't help but stand as he mused for a second. Or whether this is merely a disguised attempt to ensure that the Krogan remain isolated and with no potential access to potential resources and personnel that may try and stop the largest publicly accepted case of unwilling genetic manipulation and brutal, demoralizing mass murder. The Salarians wouldn't succeed in such a destabilization of his alliances and agreements, even if Naruto decided to let them join his forces directly. They would be watched closer than the prisoners they had from the sisters, who Ino wanted to psychoanalyze once she completed her crash course in Galactic Basic. And if they were found to have ulterior motives, Naruto would be delivering them back to their backers with a rather visceral prejudice after letting his fellow shinobi plunder every little secret they had. DeZoro and the Salarian who approached to shake his hand both winced at his accusation, highlighting their own sentiments to the genophage either deliberately or unconsciously in the face of his anger. But their lack of denial speaks more loudly and with a crystal clarity that no amount of logical bargaining and intellectual doublespeak would be able to camouflage. The genophage was a deterrent, a logical bargaining chip to dissuade Krogan expansionism and aggression. Besides, it was the Turians who used it. It was a weak argument, especially as Eschil didn't actually deny that the two Salarians she was offering to join his team were there to spy on him and potentially sabotage Rex and the rest of the Urdnot clan. Because the deterrence was working so well, and a race that your kind uplifted to fight the Rachni somehow isn't your problem to deal with. Despite his desire to continue his angry attack, and as much for the need to get rid of some of the frustration and bored anger of the last few days, his training as a ninja made him stop and sigh before doing his best to return to some semblance of calm. You understand that these two, and any others you gift me, will face considerable anger from my allies? I want to make it clear, if they aggravate Warlord Urdnot more than their mere presence in his vicinity will do automatically, I will not be coming to their aid short of stopping Rex killing them. There was an audible gulp from the scientist, while the soldier nodded as if Naruto had merely stated an obvious and unquestionable fact. Reasonable but pragmatic. Warlord has proven use and has resources that are considerable used to combat Geth. Will ensure respectful distance is maintained where possible, would appreciate assistance in arranging suitable quarters. Also, insight into Urdnot customs to avoid inadvertent cultural offense, beneficial yes? Naruto almost pointed out that trying to avoid Rex would merely piss the Krogan off more than openly confronting him. But he just said he would only step in to stop Rex or one of the others killing a Salarian. He didn't feel like being more generous given the almost threatening manner that this help had been offered. Of course, give me a day to pass on the news and I'll get you set up on the Burning Leaf. Please ensure that you are ready for boarding by 1700 hours tomorrow at the entrance to the shipyard. The repairs should be finished tomorrow, so we will be taking it for a maiden voyage to visit some old friends. Obviously something showed on his face as Eschil reacted for the first time, the slight flinch making her seem somehow much more relatable. Old friends, I remember human phrase used sarcastically to refer to enemies not yet defeated. I assume Geth our target? Reports of attacks are spreading, Alliance colonies becoming fearful of any ship that approaches. Naruto merely shrugged before going back to his paperwork. Once you have some level of council security that isn't going to allow anyone with access to a corrupt CCC officer and a few credits to find out the next day, I might tell you, counselor. Until then, for the purposes of operational security, I will keep our next target to myself. Eschil and the other two might think he was actually targeting the Geth. DeZoro would probably think a level deeper and instead think it was the Batarians or one of the larger gangs that they had been dealing with on the Citadel. The four of them took the dismissal with something approaching resigned acceptance, which made Naruto frown. Obviously, he would have to change up his approach soon as people were getting used to it. Waiting till he had confirmation that all four of them had exited the elevator at the bottom of his offices, Naruto jumped up from the desk and to the full-sized window he had installed that looked over the courtyard that his business now enclosed. Opening the window, He switched with a clone that was disguised as one of the many commuters bustling through the wards either to get to work or returning from it, no one even noticing the small burst of smoke amongst the myriad of smells and dizzying array of jostling and bustling colors. Still, DeZoro knew about his clones and about his ability to disguise himself, though judging by the conversations they had, Naruto didn't think the Solarian knew he could combine them. So better to use a decent number of clones as well as himself for this, on top of the ones that would be sweeping his office again. He'd think he was being as paranoid as Ino kept telling him, but he was still finding bugs at least once every 2 days, so there was definitely some proof that people were still after him. It was why he was working so hard to build a base of at least reasonably loyal people and not just rely on his clones, otherwise he would get blindsided eventually. It was why they were going on this particular visit first, despite the obvious targets in the Armstrong Nebula. The Geth were clearly there as a distraction, an ambush, or both. And given Naruto was already acting as a distraction, it didn't make sense for him to spring the trap just yet. Instead, Kasumi had been very useful in her work to assist CCC and the Council, even if they didn't realize they were working for a galactically wanted thief. And though she hadn't been the easiest person to befriend, it had been Ino that had wormed her way into her confidence with a little help from Ms. Lawson of all people. And though he didn't know all the details, either through Ino respecting Kasumi's privacy or because she hadn't prided herself, he knew enough to sign off on the first Black Ops mission he had chosen to go on out of moral empathy than it being a requirement for his survival, or due to orders. As a newcomer to the galactic stage, he had already received several invitations to Humanity's Ilium, as Beaconstein was known. Several of the manufacturing companies based on the planet, no doubt having heard about his new shipyard and other businesses, were hoping to either bribe him with lavish gifts or intimidate him into doing business with them on non-favorable terms. It would be interesting to see how they reacted to his arrival on the equivalent of a battleship. After the initial upgrades, it was close enough in terms of shielding and weaponry, if not straight-line speed. And in the chaos that such an arrival created, no one would notice anything untoward going on at the Hawk Estate. Not until it was far, far too late. Port Hansan Main Hangar, Noveria, 8 o'clock, May 21st, 2184. Benizia Tsoni, Asari Matriarch and Binary Helix Executive. Matriarch, your arrival isn't logged with Noveria Command. One moment please, Captain Matsuo is on her way. The simpering blather of the guard manning the security station of the main hangar almost made Benizia regret following the official rules of arriving on Noveria, rather than taking the shuttle to Peak 15 directly. Almost, but much like the voice in the back of her mind often reminded her, she was attempting to be subtle and not draw more attention to herself than her arrival already prompted. Very well. Aleshtia, handle the cargo. The 4 Asari who made up her primary companions needed no further instruction, Aleshtia and her bonded moving back towards the shuttle while Halura and her sister moved to provide a closer bodyguard orientation. Benizia was all for long discussions and debates among her coven. In fact, the opportunity to debate philosophy was something she actively encouraged. But they were here to work towards a greater goal than her own enjoyment, the cause in which her entire life had been building Tawa. Benizia frowned slightly even as the large entrance doors that led deeper into Port Hansan opened. Something about that thought struck her as odd, almost unlike her. But she could think about it later, for now she had to deal with these people. Matriarch Benizia, it is a surprise to see you here. There have been certain rumors that have reached Noveria about your affiliations, allegations that would make most cautious of even Noveria's relaxed approach. Captain Matsuo spoke in an even tone even as the half a dozen guards with her stood tensely with their weapons at the ready, more than a dozen others visible further down the long corridor that traversed the thick outer walls of Port Hansan itself. Only the practice of centuries stopped Benizia from scoffing at this level of caution on open display. These Ellenus amateurs wouldn't prove a challenge to even the youngest of her coven. If she was here with malicious intent, then most of them would die in the first minute. And it would only take that long because they all had shields no matter how pitiful they were. Such rumors are just that, Captain, rumors. No doubt spread by my rivals within Binary Helix and without. Is there going to be a problem? If there was, then Port Hansan as an outpost of spirits served her purposes just as well as it did remaining intact. Of course not, Matriarch. Administrator Anolius has offered to receive you in his office if that is acceptable. He has even waived the need for us to secure your weapons. Captain Matsuo shook her head hurriedly, though her rigid posture as she spoke made a twitch of a smile appear on Benizia's face. Clearly there was one here who wasn't a fan of the administrator's approach to handling the station. Someone to keep an eye on, as she also seemed one of the few here that was vaguely competent. In fact, it was probably better to ensure she was dealt with before they left for Peak 15. No, her internal voice whispered, such an accident would only draw attention, and the companies that also operated out of Port Hans Han would be nervous enough at her arrival. No need to have any of them doing anything hasty. First, she had to check on the veracity of the reports she had been receiving, both officially and from her planted agents on Peak 15. While the mass production of the Rachni had been solved, it seemed there was an issue controlling them when they were separated from their queen. And while rampaging Rachni could prove useful, Benizia had little time for such human wave tactics, especially if she and her coven would be forced to wipe out any surviving Rachni deployed to make sure they didn't go rogue. Acceptable for now. My coven will require assistance in unloading, transporting and securing some materials we intend to leave here at the Binary Helix offices here. I assume the lieutenant can handle such a simple task while you escort me to the administrator? The twitch to Benizia's lips returned as the human lieutenant scowled slightly at the implication of Benizia's doubt to her competence. Of course, Matriarch. Sterling, stop growling like a rabid dog and try to act a little professional. Take 10 men and assist the Matriarch's people. It was a good act, for a human at least. Lieutenant Sterling had been her contact in Port Hans Han for almost 10 years. Assigned to her by Anolius directly on her first visit after his appointment here. The materials would be going to many places other than the Binary Helix offices, sequestered away by her coven and Sterling's loyal minions, though of course they would never know why the large boxes would need to be so widespread, or even why there were so many of them. They were paid extra to do things without asking questions after all, never thinking whether such acts would one day repay their foolish greed with deadly consequences. The trap was being set, with herself playing the bait. Now it was just a question of which of the vermin they were trying to trap triggered it first, or if they would be foolish enough to come together. Such was Saren's will.